Morning, everyone. I thought the dinner was Wednesday night, so I thought we'd be past the hangovers, but maybe there's still some big hangovers still carrying over to today. I would like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on, and pay respects to elders past and present. Okay. Now, just try and work the technology. So if we could use an open source platform, we'll do better. Okay, this morning I just wanted to cover, I guess, four broad areas. Firstly, I want to give a bit of an overview of AGIMO, because I had a look at the attendance for this conference and saw that a lot of people are from the private sector, so I thought maybe they haven't had as much exposure to AGIMO as the government side would have. So I thought I'll give a bit of an overview of that. Largely to show that the areas that AGIMO cover is very, very broad. So it's not just open source, there's a lot beyond that we cover, and we've got to make sure everything interacts properly. So I thought I'd give a bit of an overview of what we do cover in AGIMO. Then, of course, looking at open source, the opportunities, the considerations that need to be thought about. This is pretty much the advice we give to all the government agencies on what they need to look at when they're considering open source. Then I want to look a bit at the international landscape, what's happening in other countries, so we can compare it to what's happening in Australia. After that, I'll move on to the actual government policy that AGIMO has put in place in regards to open source, some of the principles, and where we're going in the future. Okay, the first bit, as Dan mentioned, AGIMO is a business group at the Department of Finance and Deregulation. That just means we're one of the divisions in the department. We've got, I think, just over 200 people working at AGIMO, which, when you see the range we cover, that's not a real lot of people, because we cover a massive amount of stuff. Our purpose, as it says, is to foster the efficient and effective use of information and communication technology by Australian government departments and agencies. So basically, we're trying to make sure the government gets the best out of its money spent on ICT. We provide advice, tools, information and services to help government departments to use ICT to improve their admin and service delivery. And we work not just with the federal government, we work with the state governments as well as some international governments. So we've got a very wide area of focus. Okay, so in the leadership space, we look after whole of government ICT strategies, such as the cloud computing strategy, such as open source policy. We've also released a draft ICT strategic vision earlier this year, which hopefully will be finalised soon, which just outlines exactly where the government wants to go with its ICT. We chaired the Gov 2.0 steering committee, which of course is very important in the open data or open government space. And we also have created a whole of government strategic ICT workforce plan that's in conjunction with the Australian Public Service Commission. We do procurement on behalf of government. Now, there's a number of areas that are covered under our procurement, our whole of government procurement, including desktop hardware, licensing, and data centre facilities. Now, as a CIO of a small organisation, where I was before I joined AGIMO, I was the CIO of an organisation that had about 180 people when I started, and it's got to about 330 by the time I left. I'd come from 20 years in Centrelink that had about 25,000 people, so I got a real eye-opener when I started talking to vendors about how much their licensing costs, and the price that someone like Centrelink was getting compared to a small organisation was just starkly different. So as CIO of a small government department, I really appreciated AGIMO's work in the whole of government procurement, because it meant that all government departments, regardless of size, were getting the same pricing. So that's been fantastic, particularly for the small agencies. Okay, operationally, we look after the ICON network. The ICON network's a fibre optic system that provides point-to-point links between all Australian government agencies across the ACT. It's a secure network, or FedLink that runs with it is a secure network so that we can communicate between government departments in confidence that our data is protected. We also look after the .gov.au domain right across Australia. And we maintain the directory.gov.au, which is just a guide to the structure, the organisations and key people within the Australian government. We have a big role in policy, looking after things like ICT investment management, which looks at all big government ICT purchases and reviews the benefits, costs and risks before making a recommendation on whether the procurement should go ahead. we have a gateway reduction program. That one's largely about security. A few years ago, the Australian government had over 100 gateways, which from a security perspective is a bit of a worry. So we're trying to reduce that to the minimum practical number. And one's probably not practical because it just gives one really big target to hackers, but a smaller number than 100 is what we're aiming for. Data centre strategy. This one's consolidation of data centres. If you think there's over 200, or it's 107 FMA agencies in the government, and if every one of them's running their own data centre, there's just so much inefficiency there. So there's a strategy to consolidate data centres, which will reduce costs and reduce the environmental footprint. Staff teleworking policy. This one's helping people to work from regional areas, so we don't have to have everyone in ICT in Canberra or Sydney. We can have people working in more regional areas and connecting to their workplace securely. And it's also good for disabled employees or people undergraduate return to work. Means they don't necessarily have to come into the office every day. The IPv6 transition policy. That's obviously trying to ensure that the government can continue to communicate with citizens in the future as the IPv4 addresses run out and we're moving on to the IPv6 internet protocols. We look after the whole of government transition policy. The open source policy, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail later. And the bespoke development policy. Again, in trying to reduce costs for government, we're looking at all sort of areas. Open source is one area that can reduce costs, but also reducing bespoke developments within government. So looking to encourage the government to buy off-the-shelf products. Okay, we provide advice. One of our key publications, the Australian Government Architecture Framework. Version 3 of that is being released today. It's actually an enterprise architecture summit on in Brisbane, and Glenn Archer from AGIMO is up there today launching our new version, so that'll be available on our website later on today. That provides a common language for agencies and delivery of cross-agency services, and it supports identification of duplicate, reusable and shareable services. It contains all sorts of things like standards, principles, templates, and just makes it much more effective when government's talking about their ICT if we're all talking the same language. Better practice guidelines. We have a number of them already published and more in the works, and that's just to quickly allow the APS to improve their understanding of a range of issues related to online services. Security and authentication standards. Again, it's trying to get some standardisation across government, and also to states and territories, and the group that leads that makes a range of decisions on security matters. Australians' use of the internet and e-government services. Every year, AGIMO does a study of the Australian community to find out how it is they use the internet to interact with the government, what they like about it, what they don't like about it, and look for areas that we can improve. As part of that study, we also look at other channels as well, seeing how they're using phone to interact, how they use face-to-face, what sort of transactions they like in different channels, and a bit of demographic information to see is it just the over 70s that like face-to-face or whatever. So we do that every year and publish the results of that. We're also responsible for the web publishing and web content accessibility guidelines, so that's ensuring that all Australian government sites meet the international guidelines for accessibility. We provide a range of information on the internet, so this is some of the websites that we run on behalf of the government. Australia.gov.au is an online entry point for government information, so citizens can just go there and from there it opens up the way to other government services. We have data.gov.au, which, if anyone's familiar with the American data.gov, this is like a clone of that with Australian information. I think there's a number of other agencies around the world also copying the data.gov idea, which is a way to put public sector information, public sector data sets out in the on the internet for citizens to download, use, improve, do whatever they like with it. GovDex, those within government are probably familiar with GovDex. GovDex is a secure online collaboration tool for government, so obviously requires a log on to get into there, but there's a whole lot of different topics discussed in there in a secure manner. GovSpace, this is available to everyone. It's an online social media platform where, again, it's all about the government interacting with citizens. So all sorts of different areas are published on GovSpace by different departments so that citizens can have access to it. And this is the specific AGIMO one on GovSpace. It's the AGIMO blog, which I highly recommend people keep checking or putting RSS feeds to. This is where we put any announcement coming out of AGIMO, so any new policy will be out on the AGIMO blog on the day it comes out. Later today we'll have something up there about the release of version 3 of the architecture. Okay, that's AGIMO in a nutshell now. I have to say that what I've covered there, it covers a very broad area, but it certainly doesn't cover everything AGIMO does. I'd say that might cover 60 to 70%, but there's a whole lot of other projects there. So we have to be very careful with all our policies and advice that we don't contradict one policy with it by putting out another policy. So it's quite a mishmash of putting stuff together to make sure that everything works well. Okay, moving on to open source. Now, I'm sure no one in this room probably needs to hear all this, but beauty of open source is that it's available to view, use, modify, redistribute. There's various licensing obligations depending on the open source. It is subject to copyright in most cases, so there's a variety of sourcing options to get it. Not necessarily free. That's something we think there is a misconception that open source is always free, but there's a range of things that government departments particularly have to consider. And then there's a range, just a range of examples, and they're probably all familiar to everyone here. Okay. Right, the costs. This is the opportunities with open source. There is usually no upfront payment for most open sources. You can download it, but from a government perspective, we need to look at the total costs, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. Open source encourages competitive support services market. What we see is that because the source code is available, it's possible for any software organisation to support it. So it's not like a Microsoft product that you have to go to Microsoft to get support quite often, or one of their partners. Open source, anyone with the skills could be a potential supporter in the market. Or you mightn't even need the support services. If you're a developer like most people here, you can support it yourself because you've got the source code, so you're able to do that. Encourages collaboration. Open source is all about exchange of ideas, so it means that there's a lot of collaboration around a product, which of course leads to innovation. So that's a big plus for open source. Generally, there's less restrictions on the users as there might be for proprietary software. And really, it's up to the user what they choose to do in terms of maintenance and support, whether they think they've got the skills to do it themselves or whether they want to get a third party in. Okay. It also provides an opportunity to try software before committing to it. Often with proprietary software, there's a big upfront cost. You buy it, you install it, and then you realise it wasn't quite what it promised to be. So you think that was a waste of money. Open source, you can try it beforehand, and then you can decide whether it's the right product for you. You tend not to be locked into a particular vendor because of the fact that the source is available, so any individual or group has generally got the ability to further develop the software. Covering that again, allowing user to view and modify the source code. Again, that means you can tailor the software to meet your own needs. And it can also lead to increased stability and security. Because you're able to see the source code, you can assure yourself that where any weaknesses are, and you can tighten them if necessary. Open source tends to have more releases than proprietary software, which means that releases come to you quicker. Of course, with more releases, there's a bit of a maintenance overhead in the government departments as well to ensure that we have the latest versions and to ensure that the new release works well with all your other products that work fine with the last version. So it's a two-edged sword, but generally you do get to have your new versions much more quickly than you would with proprietary software. And increases interoperability. Because most open source software uses open standards, it makes it quite easy for them to talk to each other, so we find that it's a better for interoperability. And being modular means it's less chance that a change in one area is going to affect the rest of the package, so that's another benefit for it. Now, with all the benefits, of course, when making a decision as to whether to use open source or proprietary, there's other considerations. Now, I want to stress here that a lot of these considerations don't just affect open source. A lot are equally applicable to proprietary, but it is the sort of guidance we give to our departments of what they need to think about before they make their decisions. The total cost of ownership is quite a big one. it's often hard to compare proprietary with open source because open source mightn't have an upfront cost and the proprietary does, but we tell our agencies they need to think more broadly than that because they need to think of what support they're going to put in place and maintenance, if there's any exit costs for if they decide that product's not right for them and they need to move to something else, what's it's going to cost them to do that translation. There's installation costs, system integration, data conversion, testing. Maybe you need to hire a developer to help modify the code. So there's a number of areas that need to be considered. A lot of those also apply to proprietary, but if they're going to be comparing apples with apples, agencies need to be looking at all of those things. Warranties and indemnities. The open source software may come with no warranty, particularly if it has been free. Likewise with proprietary software, that's often an issue. So agencies need to be aware of that. If they are taking a new version of a code and it causes them problems, they probably got nowhere to go, so it's up to them to fix it. Support and maintenance, I've mentioned that a number of times. We need to look at what support and maintenance is required, particularly if you're using open source software for a mission critical application. Like all software, there's a variety of different products out there, and each of them, depending on how long they've been out, will have different maturities, different stabilities. So that needs to be considered. If you're going to be using the product for something that really is mission critical, I probably wouldn't be going for an open source tool that's just come out on the market 5 minutes ago. It'll be something that has been a good community behind it and has been proven. Agencies also need to consider the customization that might be required. So they need to look at the product. Do they need to customise it for their agency? If they do customisation, what's their requirement for feeding back into the community? I believe code forking is the term they use for if you've done your customisation and haven't fed it back in, so that they want to avoid that because the whole idea of open source is that everyone contributes, so there's no point in doing customisation that could be useful to someone else and then not feeding it back in. Okay, next slide. Let's read it quickly. Community, I've mentioned this. You want to make sure your open source has a good community behind it, that there's a large group contributing to the community and that they're involved. They're not just people that come on once a year, have a look and get out again. So you need to have a look at just what the backing is. Training for your users. If you're putting out a product, like with all products, proprietary or open source, you need to see what training is available, what training will users need. So that's an issue. Innovation. Often for an agency there can be a cost in contributing to a community. So we're looking at making changes to open source and contributing back to the community, but we need to consider what implication that has for the agency. If they're putting stuff back, do they need to have someone that answers questions for the community on what they put in there? So just need to watch what the cost is linked to it. Liability obligations, I've mentioned that with the warranty area, so just need to be aware of what the onus is on the user of the code. Portability. Here we're thinking of if you're using an open source product, at some point in the future that product might no longer be supported, or, and again it applies to proprietary, there may be a need to move from that product to a different product. So we need to look at, is it something that's in an open standard that is easily moved to another product, should that be required? Release management, something I was mentioning earlier, that there's far more releases for open source because of the frequency of updates, and that's a good thing, but it also means that from an agency perspective, everything needs to be tested before it's released. So there's an overhead cost of greater regression testing and fixing bugs or support tasks with a new version. Reliability, I think that goes without saying, we'd be looking for a reliable product going in that space. Restriction on use, that's just saying for agencies they need to just look at their contract that they're signing, look at the license and see if there are any restrictions and make sure they abide by them if there are. And lastly, security. Open source has got the potential to improve security, but having the source available also means that those that perhaps haven't got the best intentions can also see the source code. So just need to be aware that that could lead to greater hacking opportunities. So that's the range of things, the benefits and the considerations that we put out to agencies. So when you're making a decision, think of all these things and then make a balanced decision at the end of it as to whether to go with a proprietary or an open source. We think there are great savings to be made from open source, but we just say just use a bit of caution and make sure that you've analysed it properly, done a proper comparison. All right, just wanted to touch on what's going on in parts of the rest of the world. I'm not going to cover every country because there's too many, but just put a few up there, particularly the ones that we regularly do business with. I wanted to mention Brazil because certainly when I'm thinking of the leading edge IT sort of places, Brazil's not the first country that comes to mind. But in 2008, we had Peter Gershon came out from the UK at the invitation of the Australian government and did a review of all ICT across government, and he did a lot of research on what's out there around the world to see what we could adopt in the Australian government to improve our efficiency. And he actually referenced in his report Brazil and said that they're determined to effectively use the latest ICT technologies and making some of the world's largest investment in open source software. So they were probably one of the first big governments to be looking seriously at open source. And the Australian government, I guess, first started using open source probably around the late 90s and 2000, but I don't think we had a serious effort till the mid-2000s. Whereas Brazil started encouraging their government departments in November 2003 to use open source and to consider it seriously. In 2005, they moved 300,000 computers from Microsoft to Linux, which I think was virtually all of their government computers, so that was a big move. Certainly it made it clear what their indication was of the benefits of open source. In 2006, they started supporting locally produced open source products, so encouraging citizens to contribute to it. And by 2008, 73% of the large companies in Brazil were using open source. So I think they're probably a world leader in this space. Certainly one to keep an eye on. The rest of the countries are certainly catching up, but I think Brazil's led the way a bit. Okay, UK is one of the governments that we do regularly. We have a group that we call the Five Nations that collaborate quite a lot across ICT matters. It's the UK, the US, New Zealand, Canada and Australia. So I'll just cover each of those now, and these are the ones that we are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So the UK, probably a little bit behind the rest, till 2010, before they released the Open Source, Open Standards and Reuse policy. They encourage their government departments to actively and fairly consider open source solutions alongside proprietary solutions in making procurement decisions. And they do make one final step, is that if there isn't any significant monetary difference or other reason to pick one over the other, then open source should be the choice. So if all else being equal, open source is the preference for the UK government. USA, I think under Barack Obama, he had brought in a CIO called Vivek Kundra, and Vivek Kundra has been very vocal about a whole lot of things, including open source and cloud and those sort of open government type policies. So he's really been a trailblazer over there. But even before he was in place, in 2003, the Department of Defence approved the use of open source software. Of course, being Department of Defence, subject to security standards. So they're probably the first big use within the US. The current US policy mandates that open source solutions must be considered. Doesn't say they have to be chosen, but they must be considered. And the policy states that open source and non-open source are equally acceptable. The decision should be made based on merit. So effectively they're open source neutral, saying you look at them, you must consider open source and open source, but make the decision that best suits you. Canada's, I wouldn't say one that's trailblazing. They've certainly got a few good city administrations using open source. Edmonton's a great example. They're probably one of the most forward areas in Canada when it comes to IT and new technologies. But as a federal government, there isn't any clear policy that covers all of them, so they've really left it up to each individual city and each individual city CIO to make that decision as to whether open source is right for them or to have a policy on open source within there. The New Zealand government, they're encouraging agencies to assess open source alternatives if they exist, obviously, alongside the commercial software. And again, it's make a choice based on cost, functionality, interoperability, and security. So there's a bit of a common theme in most countries that is saying that compare and see which suits your needs and has the best cost. So not too many countries are going beyond telling their governments just to make an informed decision. Around the world, lots of countries have open source policies, and I think well over 100 countries have policies in different stages. A lot of them are based at state level, but there are quite a few federal government policies. Some, like Argentina and Ecuador, actually mandate the use of open source for all government agencies. That's not the line we take in Australia, so I'll go into it in a minute. Some, like Belgium, recommend consideration of the source and proprietary software equally, and that's saying there that's probably the most common policy across the world. And there's some, such as Cambodia and China, that require government departments to show a preference for open source. So, not saying you have to use it, but show a preference there. So, that's the international playing field that Australia is a part of. Now, Australia took till 2005 to release our first policy. Our first policy was one of informed neutrality, which is basically saying you shouldn't favour open source or proprietary. Look at them both equally. They can be equally accessible and equally worthwhile. And the key deciding factor being value for money. Our Commonwealth procurement guidelines that govern everything that we buy in the government has value for money as a key aspect. So that's what we're looking for in our purchases. So that was our position in 2005. Earlier this year, we released a new policy, which I think we have some copies of if anyone's interested with us today. Now, what we've said here is a bit stronger. We had been informed neutrality, we're now going to actively considering. So we're saying that agencies must consider open source before a decision is made to acquire software. So it is sending out a clear message that open source is a real alternative that governments should be considering because of the potential benefits that it offers. Value for money is still an essential component of the assessment, but we also look at the total cost of ownership when assessing that. And we also look at being fit for purpose and fit to the organisation, as well as all those issues that we mentioned in the previous slide. So it needs to be a balanced decision made. All of our IT governance policies have to go through a group called the Secretary's ICT Governance Board. That's a group of senior secretaries from the large departments. And this policy was put to them in December 2010. It went out for comment as well, and it was approved in December 2010 and applied to any ICT procurement that was started after the 1st of March. So any procurement that any government department's done in the ICT space since 1st of March, particularly for the big ones, have this requirement that open source must be equally considered. There is an opt-out policy. Like a lot of the Australian government whole of government policies, agencies can opt out. It's mandatory they follow the policy unless they formally get an opt-out. And again, it's the SIGB, the Secretary's ICT Governance Board, that can grant the policies. It's not an easy process to get out of following a government policy, and to date, no one has opted out of open source. So all government departments are required to follow the open source policy. Now, there's 3 principles to the policy. The first is that Australian government ICT procurement processes must actively and fairly consider all types of available software, both open source and proprietary. Now, we have a bit of a dividing field in procurements of those above 80,000, which we consider to be the large procurements, and those under 80,000. Now, for all those above 80,000, agencies have to create a procurement plan and have to go do a request for tender to the market. And in doing that, they must put in their tender that open source has to be considered. For those under 80,000, it's a slightly less rigorous process they have to go through. There still needs to be a market test done, but that can be at a lower level, and the agency has to document why they've made the decision that they've made. So they have to show in their documentation, which can be audited by the Australian National Audit Office, and any audit results are tabled in Parliament, but they have to document that they considered open source, what they considered, why they made the decision they made, either for open source or for proprietary. So it's all got to be kept by the department so that it can be checked later. The second principle applies to vendors. So we've put out this policy that is meant to apply to government departments, but we've also got a principle there that applies to those dealing with the government, which is that suppliers must consider all types of available software when dealing with Australian government agencies. So any vendor that's responding to one of our tenders has to give an open source option, or they have to give a reason why they haven't, and then it's up to the agency to decide, is that a valid reason? Now, I'd imagine that a vendor who has a 100% agreement with Microsoft would probably put that into their tender response, and that may be valid, but it's up to the agency to make that decision as to whether to accept the tender documentation if they haven't made an open source and a proprietary offering. Agencies are required to write in their tender documentation that suppliers have to do that. So anyone responding to a tender knows that they have to do this and knows that we will be scrutinising it when it comes in. And so suppliers have to put it in their response to our tenders. The third policy is about the community. So community is I think, very important for open source. I mean, it's what makes the open source so powerful. So we've told all Australian government agencies that when they are participating in the open source software community, they should be openly participating in the open source software communities and contribute back where appropriate. We have spoken to a large number of agencies that are using open source to ask them about their contributing back. What we're finding is that in general, when a government department's using open source, they're just taking the product as it is. So they'll download Firefox and use it as it is. There doesn't seem to be that much development going on in agencies. So thus far, we haven't seen a lot of contributing changes back into communities. But it doesn't mean they're not taking the benefits of the open source. It's just they're taking them as they are and using the contributions that others in the communities make. Now, every year we survey all of our FMA agencies, which is the 107 agencies covered by the Financial Management and Accountability Act. And we ask them a range of questions, but one of which is it covers their open source. And in the 2011 survey, which I think was done around June this year, we found that almost 60 agencies said that they were using open source software, which had come up a bit from the year before. So there is a steady improvement in the numbers of agencies using open source software. We also asked them about what sort of software they're using, and we found there's over 750 open source implementations with over 200 products in use. So we were quite happy with that number. Again, that had come up a reasonable amount since the previous survey, and we're looking forward to the 2012 survey to see how our new policy has impacted, because with the new policy only coming into effect from 1st of March, and we actually started gathering information for the survey from around that time for publication in June, really this is still based on the old policy. So we think that the new policy could have a shift in that, and we're looking forward to next year's survey to see how big an impact that has had. Some of the platforms that we're seeing it used on: Windows, Solaris, Unix, Mac, from no surprises there. And just to, it's over 200 products, but just to give an idea, there's web platforms such as Apache, there's operating systems such as Red Hat Linux, geospatial applications very popular in government departments like Google Earth, and web browsers such as Mozilla Firefox. Just a range, but very broad types of software being used by Australian government departments at the moment. In putting together the research for this presentation, I came across this quote in a report which I thought was quite good. Australia is one of the countries that stands out for its open source activity, particularly the participation of its communities on both a national and international level. That came out in 2010, and I thought that's a bit of a tick for Australia. This report, which is available on the web, goes through virtually every country in the world and says where they're up to with their open source, and a lot of them don't have positive comments. So Australia was one of the more positive comments, so I thought that was worth bringing here. Now, where to from here? As I said, we released our policy in December, implementing from 1st of March. We will continue to monitor usage and just see how effective that policy has been, and we'll be doing that in the first half of next year and publishing those results so we can see. We're expecting we'll have a reasonable increase in the amount of open source software used across government as a result of our new policy. As I said earlier, we don't mandate that they have to use open source policy because as Australian government we still have an open playing field policy that any vendor should have an ability to be able to deal with the government. So we'd see as mandating open source would be disadvantageous to proprietary software vendors. So we enforce that government agencies have to consider open source and proprietary, but we don't say they should be choosing one or the other. They've got to make an informed decision. And just a couple of predictions from Gartner there that by 2016, 50% of leading non-IT organisations will be using open source software as a business strategy to gain competitive advantage. Competitive advantage isn't one of the things that government looks for, because we don't really have competitors, but we're certainly looking to be effective and efficient. It would be our slant on that. And by 2016, open source software will be included in mission-critical software portfolios within 99% of Global 2000 enterprises. That's a pretty significant number, I think. Probably a brave prediction, but Gartner's been following this space for a long time, and they're looking at that number's going to go from 75% to 99 in the space of 6 years. So that's just showing just how prevalent open source software is becoming out there. So a lot of agencies, a lot of private companies are seeing the benefits of open source. So that's probably a good thing. Now, further information, we do have copies of the policy if anyone's interested. We'll have them maybe out on the front counter here after this that people can just pick up. Or alternatively, you can look on the finance website. We also run an open source community of interest. Now, that's only for members of the APS. If there's anyone within the government here that's not a member of that would like to be, they can contact us afterwards, and we'll make sure they're put onto that group. It's a group that it's an information sharing forum, so it's really just a group that gets together 2 or 3 times a year and just discusses what's going on in government and how open source is helping them, what issues they might have. So that's quite a useful forum we find for exchanging ideas across government. Got the email address there for anyone from the government that wants to be a part of the community of interest. It's architecture@finance.gov.au. Or if anyone from outside government's got any questions, they can also use that. Our website has an amazing amount of information, I have to say. Just about everything I covered about AGIMO is in there in far more detail. If there was anything you want to look at, more information. There's also a lot about all the ICT policies and how they apply to government departments and how they apply to private enterprise as well. And that's it. Thank you. I can do some questions.
Any questions? Paul?
IP version 6 is a topic that's my heart. I worked in an outsourcer for a government agency until about May this year, and I work for a company now that supplies software to government departments. And the impression that I'm getting, certainly from when I was inside and outside, is that they're seeing the AGIMO requirement that government agencies deploy IP version 6 by 2012 was more like a guideline than a requirement. Is that your impression?
Definitely not. Definitely not. It is a requirement. We have the transition strategy is available on our website. We've actually had it in place since about 2008. And we survey our agencies every quarter on their progress, and anyone that's not meeting the sort of milestones we'd be expecting in their journey to get into full compliance, we contact and ask them what the problem is and how can we help and put them in touch with someone that possibly can help them. Our focus is dealing with citizens, so what we're looking at is the outwardly facing applications. So we aren't certainly not insisting that all agencies are fully compliant internally, but certainly externally by the end of 2012 now. Our stats so far, our latest survey we did in October, so it's very recent, is looking very promising that we think the vast majority are definitely going to make that 2012 deadline. So we're quite happy with the results of that. It's just one of our strategies is going really well. John actually leads the strategy, so I'm more than happy with IPv6.
Could you give us some idea how much federal government spends on software procurement?
I think the quoted figure is about $4 billion a year.
4 billion a year.
Yes, that sounds right. The UK government is obviously much bigger than us, and they're about 4 times the size. But I think the federal government is about $4 billion a year that is spent on software. I'm saying that off the top of my head. It's definitely in one of the reports. The Gershon report is available on the website, and that was done in 2008. So it's a few years out of date now, but it's probably the most comprehensive study of government ICT that's been done in Australia, and that goes into details of what's spent and where it's spent, but from memory it's about $4 billion a year.
You've spoken about a lot of very sensible principles about things like ensuring value for money and fit for purpose and all those kinds of things, but one thing I haven't really heard is is other considerations like national sovereignty over our own citizens' data, for example.
Yeah, sure.
The use of the reason I think some countries do have stronger policies that have mandate requirements is because there is an issue that if data is being generated by the government on behalf of the citizens and held in trust, then there's a certain requirement that not be subject to things out of Australia's control, software provided by other countries that we have no control over the standard.
Yeah, as I was saying at the start, AGIMO does a whole lot of different areas and different focuses. I mean, I was just looking at the open source one today. We also have a cloud strategy, which is available on the website. That's where we deal with the issues of data being held in the cloud and data sovereignty. There's very clear guidelines in that. We obviously deal with DSD, who have come out and said that there shouldn't be any private data stored offshore. So that's our policy. We do store some government data offshore, but it's not private stuff. Data.gov.au, I think that's actually stored in an Amazon cloud, but there's nothing that's making data freely available to citizens. So, I mean, there's nothing private in there. So, but certainly the government policy, which is articulated in the cloud policy, is that private data doesn't go offshore. We go a bit beyond that and also say you need to be careful of, even if there's a data centre down the road, who owns it. So, is it owned by a big multinational? So, it's just a lot of considerations, and obviously we deal with things like the Patriot Act and what sort of access the US government and other governments. I mean, the US certainly don't have a monopoly on the Patriot Act. The Canadian government has one, which I haven't read, but according to the Canadian government, it's actually tougher than the Patriot Act. So we need to be aware of all those things, and we certainly give advice to agencies if they do want to look at it.
Can I just clarify, that's certainly partially responsive to my question, but I'm also concerned about data formats as well, that we not be locked into formats that we don't have clear documentation or rights to access our own data in the future.
Yeah, standards does play a big part in what we do, data standards. So the Australian Government Architecture Framework, that lists a lot of standards. We do work internationally, so we keep track of the stuff that NIST brings out, the US Standards Agency. So it is a big part, because obviously we want to have government interoperability as well, and if you go back, I don't know, 15, 20 years when every government department worked in a silo, there was no standards, and if you had to deal with them, you had to develop standards for that link. But we've got to come a long way from then, and the Australian government architecture does deal quite heavily in standards and conventions.
Bob. Oh.
Why was Google open for the use of open source software? Do you understand the difference between free and beer and open source?
Yes, I mean, Google's an interesting one in that some of their stuff is open source and some isn't. So, yeah, I'm going to confess that I didn't put that picture together. But, yeah, some part of Google is open source, some aren't, so probably Google Earth wasn't a good example, so I'll accept that.
You mentioned the survey that you did last year, and there's another one.
Yeah.
All the data for that, is that published?
No, that's an internal survey. What we often do is publish some rolled up statistics. I mean, obviously at our level we can see what department, what product they're using, how many users they've got, that sort of stuff, and we use that for making some of our whole of government type decisions. But we don't actually publish the results other than rolled up.
In particular, I'd be interested in knowing what those 200 open source projects that are in use and going
The products.
are.
Um,
I mean, I don't mind which government departments use it, but it would be interesting to know which open source projects some government departments have blessed. How popular each project is obviously is also interesting. But
yeah, we have released some information on that. Generally, we've put some stuff out in the media about some of the products, and I had some listed on one of the sites here, but there was actually a media release probably 2 or 3 months ago now that listed about 20 of the most common ones there.
right. I'm an author of an open source project, and I'd be interested to know if it was in use in Australian government. Now, that's the sort of information that I can't actually find out because it's a free software project. I don't know who downloads it and who uses it. I mean, sometimes they tell me. I mean, I know that it's used at Civil University and in Technical University and Legal Aid Manitoba and places like this, but I don't know. Is it in use in Australian government, maybe it is. I'm curious, and that's why it would be nice to just have a list of all the
Yeah, something I'll take on board. I'll take back and discuss it with the team.
I'll get to one and I'll get to you, Scott, next. I've got a question for you. What kind of, obviously the drive to adopt a really rigorous sort of thought out open source procurement requires actually some role models actually within government sometimes. Is there any government projects that have been really forthgoing and have had a really good success with open source project software?
Do you want that one? I just want to break.
Yeah. One of the major agencies that we've been in discussions with is the ATO.
Yeah.
They use a whole range of open source products across a wide range of their programs. So major agencies, the big ones, are right into it. Yes. Our survey also shows that we have pockets of interest from some of the smaller agencies, and as Brian was saying, we've got that information. It's not publicly available, but as Andrew has requested, maybe we can take that to our management and say we've had a request from this community to get this information in some sort of format that we can release publicly. Yeah. And if, as long as we're not breaking any of the security guidelines that DSD and agencies tell us constantly about, we'll look at getting it up there.
Scott.
I've got, in some way, a similar question to about the sort of 200 products. I do contracting consulting for defence, and the number of open source products they use in there is in the thousands, not in the 200. And in particular, it's just a huge number, particularly any of the science guys or the research guys or anything building hardware that use open compilers or GCC agreements as standard. Is that sort of level of stuff taken into consideration when you're looking at products, or is it mainly just sort of the end user type open source products that you're looking at, like ancient firewalls?
We're pretty broad. We send out, it's actually a very large spreadsheet that we send out to every agency once a year, and they fill out the different products they're using. I can tell you Defence certainly isn't listing over 1,000 because no one is listing that many. So we are a bit at the mercy of the agencies to give us accurate information. We obviously aren't going into the agency and doing a stock take ourselves. We send out the spreadsheet to them, they complete it and send it back to us, and we collate it. So we certainly aren't restricting it to just end user or anything like that.
I imagine just as a total guess, but in the defence space, the IT departments are more proprietary based, whereas it's the engineers and the scientists and the other work
possibly.
They're probably not the ones getting the spreadsheet. It's probably the IT department. I'm just getting
yeah, quite possibly. I mean, the spreadsheet goes out to the CIO, an agency as big as Defence, they'd probably send it out to a number of other people to complete. I'm sure the CIO himself doesn't complete it, but so if they're not getting to the right area, there's not a lot we can do. We take back the information that we get and use it as best we can. So.
And
also ask for clarification. So when we were talking about sovereignty and jurisdiction from that a minute ago, we were talking about private citizen data and public data. So when you're taking a government website, for example, that has information that's publicly available to people, and might also have another section at the back end that the employees of that agency might be willing to use and share information with. Where would your jurisdiction, where would your recommendation for government departments and agencies be for that jurisdiction? Would that be hosted in Australia by the Australian service, or that be hosted outside?
Definitely anything that's got private information has to be in Australia. But there's some...
When we say private, for example, the website has a public face, so is that considered public, or would that be...
No, that'd be the public, but if the website then has I don't know, say a human services website where you're putting in details for claiming a pension or something like that, anything like that obviously has to be in Australian soil. So any citizen information that's coming in has to be in a data centre within Australian soil.
Yeah, so what would you recommend if I was a government agency and I was coming to you and for my public-facing website, what would my recommendation be in the jurisdiction that I should be hosting it?
I would recommend that they need to be getting the best value for money that fits them. So that could mean they split the site into two and host one externally and one within Australian soil. If that's not possible, then I'm saying, well, you've got to go for the lowest common denominator, and if you've got citizen data, you need to host it in Australian sovereignty. So.
Okay, it's interesting because there's a lot of other governments actually stipulate even also public-facing websites.
If public-facing websites, I mean, that's information that's out in public domain already, so it's not something that's going to release citizen data or something like that, as long as they've got the right security around it. So, I mean, we don't have a problem with public-facing data that's already available out in the public to be hosted offshore, as long as anything that is citizen is protected, so that needs to be onshore.
Arjun?
You're also responsible for IPv6 strategy. Give us a very quick result.
John leads that strategy. So.
Okay, the IPv6 strategy, we released it, developed it in 2007, released it in 2008. Its initial release date had a completion date of 2015. It's reviewed annually in 2009. We looked at what was happening in the world and realised that 2015 was too long. We've now brought that date forward to 2012. By the end of 2012, 31 December 2012, I expect to have somewhere between 85 to 90% of government agencies operating in a dual stack environment. That the 10% that probably won't make that date will make that by probably March, April 2013. I survey agencies on a quarterly basis. As Brian was saying, those agencies that are dragging the chain somewhat get a phone call from me, and I have to say a lot of the agency CIOs don't like me. I'm their quarterly nemesis. I ring them and harass them for their survey results. We've been able to achieve a 100% response rate on every one of our 11 surveys. That's a result that is almost unheard of in government. So the information I push up the line to my executive and to them, to the government and to ultimately my minister, is as up to date as it can be. And we get directions from our Chief Information Officer Committee about where they think the next step is and how we should progress it. I also provide secretariat services to our community of expertise. They're normally the techos from a range of government agencies, some quite large and some smaller ones. We do an annual review of our the transition strategy and also our work plan. Our transition strategy is up on the finance website. It's a publicly available document. The work plan was designed to be an agency's eyes only document, but I'm aware that agencies are giving it to their outsourcers to guide them through the process. I fully expect to be able to report by mid-2013 that every Australian government FMA Act agency is operating in a dual stack environment.
And just to add to that, I think it was last month, the month before, John was down in Melbourne talking at the IPv6 summit in Melbourne. His presentation is actually available on the AGIMO blog, and that actually gives you the statistics of government departments and where they're up to. It doesn't name departments, just gives you the overall feel for how things are going.
I'm pretty much going to have to call it there for questions. Do you have any final words, John?
Last question. Go.
The Gerson report recommendations, where they are, is that implemented or still in progress?
You'll see when I listed a lot of those different projects that AGIMO's doing, a lot of them have come out of Gerson. So we are certainly still progressing with some of that. Gerson came out in 2008, so things like cloud don't get a mention in Gerson, except maybe just a passing glimpse. So there's been a few changes need to be made as a result of the changed landscape. But most of the recommendations are well implemented. So.
And finally, I have 100 copies of our open source policy. The guide is a lot larger document, so I couldn't print that out. I would have killed our printers. But the policy, I'll just put on the corner here. If you're interested, grab a copy. If you have any questions, please contact us at architecture@finance.gov.au, and we'd be more than happy to assist you if we can.
Thank you.
I'd like to put